What lay behind the years of silence she placed in divine hands, and there perhaps she thought it should remain unresolved, unexplored, and unexplained. A personal burden, she did not register her story in the archive of African American sorrow, nor did she pass it down to her sons and their children as a cautionary tale about the perils of whiteness, nor offer it up as an inscription on the Williams totem pole. All of that Lillian Williams left for others to do, while on her mantelpiece she placed a photograph of Edwin and moved on with her life with a life that was at once pious and plenteous.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, Boston Public Library, and the Museum of African American History, ably produced by GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, NEHGS, and producer of the American Inspiration Series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us in the land of history, looking at legal practices and untold stories from the last century, racism in the Jim Crow South. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the new book, By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Margaret A. Burnham is the founding director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University School of Law. She has also been a staffer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She's been a civil rights lawyer, a defense attorney, and a judge. A professor of law, she was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve on the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. In 2010, she headed a team in a landmark case that settled a federal lawsuit in which Mississippi law enforcement officials were accused of assisting Klansmen in the 1964 kidnapping, torture, and murder of two 19-year-olds, Henry D. and Charles Eddie Moore. With this legal and teaching and civic background, Professor Burnham was and is uniquely able to write this very important book and tell these stories. So, all based on fact. Now, for further introductions, over to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Margaret. And on behalf of the Boston Public Library, welcome everyone. I'm Kristen Motti from the programs team at the library. We are grateful to be in partnership on tonight's program in the American Inspiration Series with the Museum of African American History, American Ancestors, NEHGS, and the GBH Forum Network, all neighbors in Boston. Tonight, I have the honor of sharing a little bit of information about our moderator, Lemerci Frazier. Lemerci Frazier is a visual artist, public historian and artist, innovator, poet, and holographer. She is Executive Director of Creative and Strategic Planning at Spoke Art, also Boston-based. She was formerly Director of Education and Interpretation for the Museum of African American History, Boston, Nantucket. Frazier has served the artistic community for over 20 years as an award-winning national and international visual and performance artist and poet. Her collective works are in the Smithsonian, the White House, Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the Dallas Museum of Art. Her work supports the dialogues that concern social justice and restoration, civil and human rights. We'll meet Lemerci Frazier in just a moment, but now please join me in welcoming from the Museum of African American History, Christian Walks, who's going to welcome on behalf of Ma and also welcome Professor Burnham. Christian, over to you.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Museum of African American History. On behalf of the museum, it is my honor to welcome today's author, Professor Margaret Burnham. Professor Burnham, we look forward to the invaluable insight you will provide. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to our esteemed author. Professor Burnham, please, Give us a guide into your work.
Thank you so very much. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here, and especially to be here in the company of these wonderful, esteemed organizations so valued here in Boston. The Museum of African American History, WGBH, our public library, and the American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm really looking forward to today's event. I will start by saying that this project began 10 years ago and really was centered on American families. My colleagues and I began looking back at civil rights cases that had been mistried during the 1960s. And we quickly realized that there was a period of time in our nation's history, earlier period of time, in which there were similar atrocities, that is to say, African Americans subjected to brutal killings that were not remediated by our courts, and that period had really not been fully explored by activists or by scholars, and that there were families out there who had deep and traumatic memories of this period, who were carrying those memories around with them. And my students and I here at Northeastern University School of Law, along with my dear colleague, Melissa Nobles, who is a political scientist and now a chancellor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, determined that there was something we could do for those families, that we could recover the documents that told the story of these cases, that we could partner with these families more fully to integrate this history into the long stream of American history, and thereby flesh out what had occurred in our country in the 1930s, the decade of the Depression, and on into the 1940s, the decade of the war. And so this book is one effort to tell that story. The second product of our work is reflected in an archive that we put together. It's called the Burnham Nobles Archive, and we'll provide the address for all of us in this listening audience later on this evening. The archive collects 1,000 cases of individuals who were killed because they violated some Jim Crow norm during this period, 1930 through 1940 and on into the 1950s, and when their cases were not adequately treated by the justice system, either local or national, and indeed when the cases and the lives of these individuals were erased and rendered invisible. And so through the archive and the book, we hope to reclaim this history, not just for the families, but for all of us who care about American history. So I do want to share some of these stories through some images, and I'd love to have some slides. Thank you so much for starting us off. First slide, folks. So here we are. We're out in the field. We're in Mississippi. The quality of the picture isn't that great, but you can see in this image my colleague, Professor Nobles, over on the left-hand side of the screen, and myself. And these two members, two individuals in the photograph are families, members of an individual who was the victim of a Jim Crow killing in Mississippi. And here we are down on their farm. And this is how we traveled really around the country, mostly around the South, actually exclusively around the South. We chose the states of the Confederacy to begin this project because that's where the majority of these killings took place. And we'd sit across the table and share our documents with the family members and have them tell us about their experiences and thereby try to generate a full and complete picture, comprehensive picture, including including the experiences of the family members themselves, along with the official documents. Next slide. In addition to meeting with family members, we also met with communities, seeking to return this material to communities so that they could fully integrate the material into their own understandings of their history. So here we are in Jackson, Mississippi, and the gentleman on the right-hand side is the current president of the NAACP, President Johnson of the NAACP. This photograph was taken, again, as we traveled across the country, seeking to reintegrate these cases back into the communities from whence they had come. Next slide. In addition to working with families to get their stories, we also partnered with families to memorialize the events in whatever way they felt was suitable and appropriate. This is the family of Isaiah Nixon, a man who was killed in 1948 in Alston, Georgia, because he attempted to vote. After he came back from the polls, he was killed right on his porch in front of his wife and his children. His wife, who's sitting there on the stool, left Alston, Georgia immediately with her children and did not return until this event, actually. She left and fled to Florida, where she raised her children, and she returned at this event at the gravestone of Isaiah Nixon so that we could commemorate the sacrifice that he had made for his country, seeking to enlarge the suffrage, enlarge the franchise at a time when it was denied across the board to African Americans. Next slide. In addition, we reached out to the national civil rights community. Here we are with Benny Thompson. You may recognize his face from the January 6th hearings, representative from Mississippi. And as well, we're with Rita Bender Schwerner, who is the wife of Michael Schwerner, was killed in Mississippi in 1964, and Margaret Evers, wife of Medgar Evers, killed in Mississippi in Jackson in 1963. And on the left-hand side, my colleague, Charles Ogletree. Here again, our efforts were not just to get the facts and develop the story with the families, but as well to lobby Congress so that these cases could be fully investigated, not just by law students, but indeed by the government itself. Next slide. Students were deeply involved in this project. And this was one of my students talking to an elder in Baton Rouge, getting his story while it was still available to us. And that's one reason we pushed to get this work done. These are aging individuals who hold these memories, and their memories obviously will go when they go. And so we moved as rapidly as we could and with as much support as we could get, using students really all over the country. Vassar University, this young man is from Southern University in Baton Rouge, in order to collect the memories of our seniors. Next slide. Now on to the book. The book opens with a chapter on rendition. And rendition was the process, the legal process by which individuals who fled the South were returned to the North, fled the South for the North, were subject to legal proceedings that would determine their future, their destiny, whether they would be able to remain in northern locations, much like fugitive slaves running from slavery up to northern locations. And I focused my chapter on Detroit, on 3 cases where individuals fled the South for Detroit, all ending up in the same Black Bottom neighborhood in Detroit. This is the story of a man who in May 1938 was forced to flee Yazoo City, a small town in Yazoo City, Bentonia, for Detroit. And this is the advertisement that was put in the newspaper by the Yazoo City, Mississippi sheriff, describing this gentleman as weight 115 pounds, hair kinky, nose flat, 2 gold upper front teeth, complexion solid black. This is an ad that appeared in a detective magazine, The Master Detective, and it's an ad that ultimately resulted in the arrest of this gentleman, Wash Ellis, and in a legal proceeding in which he was ultimately successful, where he was sought to be returned to the South, and Detroit refused to do so. Public officials, in Michigan, refused to do so, saying that to return him would subject him to proceedings that would at best be unjust, but perhaps even more probable to a lynching. Next slide. I also tell the story of Viola Edwards, who also ended up in Detroit in 1928. This is a woman who ran a hospital, in which an individual came to the hospital, sought an abortion, and died from septic infection as a consequence of the abortion. This was a white woman attending a Black hospital. Viola Edwards was the owner of the hospital, and she quickly realized that in order to save her own life, she would have to flee from Pensacola, Florida. She fled and ended up in the same place in Detroit, and ultimately was able to resume her life in Detroit. It was a far diminished life. She was a prominent person in Pensacola, but I tell as well her story. Next slide. This gentleman is a lawyer. His name is, as you can see, is William Henry Huff. And Mr. Huff was born and raised in Oglethorpe County, Georgia. He too moved to Detroit, and moved north, and successfully defended 77 of these rendition cases much like the 2 that I've just described to you. So this practice of trying to preserve the lives and safety and well-being of individuals who fled the South really became a practice, a complicated practice engaged in by mostly African-American lawyers in northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Pennsylvania. And Mr. Huff, whose story I tell in the book, is one of the more prominent lawyers who engaged in this work. I move on from the rendition cases to tell the story of soldiers who also traveled. We're now in World War II, the lead up and the slightly aftermath of World War II, when soldiers were required to travel to bases, most of which were situated in the South, and when thousands of African-American soldiers, many of them from northern venues, traveled south and had to risk the challenges of riding Jim Crow. Next slide. This is one of the more prominent cases, and one that was not really well known until we picked it up and began to investigate it back in 2014. Booker Spicely was a soldier from Philadelphia who was stationed in Camp Butner, right outside of Durham. On this particular evening, June 8th of 1944, Booker Spicely, dressed in the uniform you see him in here, traveled from Durham back to his base. He was told to move to the back of the bus when another soldier, dressed in the very same uniform, this time a white soldier got on the bus. Booker Spicely protested, and the driver quarreled with him. Shortly thereafter, as Booker Spicely exited the bus, he was shot to death on the streets of Durham, right outside the bus, right there, and left to die in the curb in Durham. The driver was, of course, prosecuted in this case. We're in North Carolina, not in Mississippi, not in Alabama. However, he was very quickly exonerated. The jury found him not guilty. We picked up the Spicely case and were in touch with his relatives. But more importantly, this case was picked up by residents of North Carolina, by lawyers and others, and just ordinary citizens in North Carolina who recently were able to reach out to the Duke County Energy Foundation. Duke County, the Duke Corporation ran the buses in Durham, so they were responsible for the bus on which Booker Spicely was killed. And just a month ago, the local group in North Carolina were able to get the Duke Energy Foundation to contribute $100,000 to North Carolina Central University so that they could establish a law veterans center in the name of Booker Spicely. I say this because I want to emphasize how recent this history actually is, and how possible it still is to come full circle on these cases. Next slide. Timothy Hood, another soldier who lost his life on a bus, this time on a bus in Bessemer, Alabama, when he rode as a veteran in 1946, riding into town, told to move to the back of the bus. He protested and he said, "Where I just came from, i.e. abroad, fighting in the war, we didn't have Jim Crow." And for that, he was ultimately shot and killed. I show here his photograph, and on the left-hand side, that of his father, who was called to the police car in which Timothy Hood's body lay. And he couldn't understand what had happened, what had gotten into his son, is what he said. He said, "These boys who've come back to the war from the war, I just can't understand what it is they want." Down below, I show the next generation down. That gentleman in front of the mic is Timothy Hood's nephew. And he worked with us in order to get Timothy Hood's case reintegrated into the local history in Bessemer, Alabama. He's since passed away, but he worked with us for many years in order to lift up the story of his uncle, Timothy Hood, the veteran from Bessemer. Next slide, please. And then move on to talk about the role of policing in the South. And it was not just bus drivers who maintained Jim Crow through the bullet of a gun, as we saw in both the Hood case as well as in the Spicely case. But also here I talk about police in order to more fully understand the through line between policing then and policing now. And I illustrate this through a number of cases. And I look at one particular area, one particular judicial district, to think about the role of prosecutors, or to try to reconstruct the role of prosecutors during this period of time. This is the Walter Gunn case. I should simply say here, Walter Gunn, again, was killed in 1942 by a horrible incident. This is his relative who we were able to talk to and recover her memories about the case. And she too has passed on since we talked to her. Next slide. In the same judicial district as Walter, as the last case, the Walter Gunn case, That was a 1942 case. The prosecutor who tried that case lost it. And local U.S. attorney, he was reluctant to try another case simply because prosecutors don't try cases to lose them. They try them to win them. And these cases were ultimately unwinnable. It was not until 1950, notwithstanding the extent of violence that it was occurring in this particular judicial district, it took until 1950 when this prosecutor tried once again a police officer who had murdered a young man. The young man killed in this case is the young man on the right-hand side of the screen, Willie Carlisle. Willie Carlisle had attended had snuck into a dance and thereafter arrested. He and another young man in a prank pierced the tires of the police officers who had arrested them. The police officers then chased them down, took them to the police station, and beat Willie Carlisle to death. His murder was ultimately vindicated. The police officer who beat him to death at the police station was in fact convicted and sentenced to 10 months. So with time, the situation changed, the pattern of prosecution changed, but it took a long time. Next slide. Next slide. This gruesome picture is of a man whose case was ultimately decided in the Supreme Court. This man, Robert Hall, was killed on the steps of a courthouse in Georgia, dragged from his home, and then killed by the sheriff and two deputies. His case, called the Screws case, ultimately ended up in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decided the case in 1944, but the Supreme Court's decision chilled the enforcement of civil rights and the right really to live free of racial violence in the South because the opinion was confusing and did nothing to further encourage these prosecutions. Next slide. I tell the story of one case that emerged as a result of the Screws case, a case that followed shortly on the heels of the Screws case. Willie Lee Davis was also a soldier. This killing took place on July 3rd, the eve of our national anniversary, of course, national holiday, in 1943, little small town in Georgia. Willie Lee Davis was killed again by the local police officer for sticking up for himself. He told the police officer, "I'm not your man now, I'm Uncle Sam's man." And moments thereafter, he was shot and killed. Picture on the right is a photograph of his mother, who left her. You see her there in her outfit, the clothing she wore in her daily work. She left the small town where she and her ancestors had grown up and moved to New York so she could be closer to the NAACP and to Thurgood Marshall and hopefully vindicate the death of her son. She was never able to do that, in part because of the consequence, the effect of the Screws case on these prosecutions. Next slide. This photograph I received just a few days ago from a woman who read the book and let me know that she was a relative of Willie Davis and of Ethel Davis, the two people you saw in the last picture. And she sent me this picture to round out their story, to round out their ancestors. And she said, these two women are the sisters of Ethel Davis and therefore the aunts of Willie Davis. She had never before, until she opened the book, seen a picture of her relative, Willie Davis. So the book is getting out there. It's reaching relatives. It's doing what I had very much hoped it would do. Next slide. And this photograph is of a gentleman by the name of Marvin Cox, a professor, former professor, he is since deceased, at the University of Connecticut, whom we spoke with in 2013 or 2014 about the Willie Davis case. Marvin Cox's relatives were the family that Ethel Davis worked for years. And he gave us his memories of Willie Davis and of Ethel Davis, and described her as a wonderful woman who was driven driven to get to the bottom of the killing of her son, Willie Davis. Next slide. I focus as well on Birmingham, Alabama. So one has to choose a particular venue if one wants to drill deep down, and the venue I chose here was Birmingham. Looking at the police violence, the incidents of police violence in Birmingham in the 1930s, 1940s. We all know Birmingham from 1960s. We know the marches in Birmingham. We know about the police dogs. We know about Bull Connor. We know about the activities led by Martin Luther King and the Children's Campaign in Birmingham. Far less is known about this earlier period of activity and resistance in Birmingham. This slide tells a bit of the story of Captain Leonard Butler, a miner, M-I-N-E-R, who was employed in Birmingham as a union organizer and as a miner, and who was killed by two officers associated with the mine he worked with in a completely unjustified and brutal killing. So when Butler was killed, he was a very, very popular union leader. 2,000 miners, this is 1948, folks, 2,000 miners around Birmingham left their jobs in a wildcat strike to protest the murder of Captain Butler. And so I tell his story because it's not well known and because it illustrates so well the depth of the resistance, not just among African-American community, but sometimes as well among the white community. These were white and Black miners, all of whom left the mines in protest of the killing of this 48-year-old man in 1948. Next to him is a photograph of his daughter. The family fled immediately after Butler was killed, fled Birmingham, and moved to Saginaw, Michigan, which is where we found Vida Rouse, the daughter, who told us about her family's the family's flight from Birmingham and their efforts to reestablish themselves in Saginaw, Michigan. All of which illustrates the national nature of this story. People didn't stay in the South, as we well know from what we know about the Great Migration. They left. But not only were they pulled to northern venues, they were pushed out of the South. And it was in part the violence that was so prevalent there that forced them to leave and to find succor and refuge in places like Saginaw, Michigan. Next slide. Emory Jackson was the editor of the Birmingham World over the 1940s and 1930s. And the book recounts not just the killings that I've described to you, but also the efforts of newspapermen like Emory Jackson to alert and alarm the larger community, not just a local community, but indeed a national community, by reporting on these events, oftentimes taking their lives in their hands in order to do so. Emory Jackson was one of those brave and persistent journalists who kept at it, and whose on account of whose labors we're able to, without whose labors, we would never be able to reconstruct these stories. He worked at a local level. We relied very heavily on the national press, and by that I mean the African American national press, Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American. They carried these stories as well, and they carried them into locations, small towns where there were no newspapers, or where the newspapers were afraid to talk about what had transpired. Next slide. So I argue in the book, in my final chapters of the book, I describe a few cases to illustrate the need for repair and reparation of this history, that the need for a measure of restorative justice to address this history. And this case of Albert Williams perfectly illustrates that. Albert Williams was a member of the NAACP, and you see the full chapter there on the right-hand side, which formed in 1939, intending to encourage African Americans to vote, many of them encouraging African Americans to vote for the Republican ticket in the upcoming 1940 election. Albert Williams was not a prominent leader, but one of the leaders of the branch. Members of the branch were chased out of town, told to turn over the membership list to the sheriff and others, and they turned over the name of Albert Williams. Albert Williams was pulled out of his home in the middle of the night, left in his pajamas, left behind his wife. He had no children, married for a number of years. She found his body on the banks of the nearby river in Haywood County, shortly after his kidnapping. His story is not well known, but it is getting much more attention across the country, and particularly in Tennessee. In Tennessee, recently, the local prosecutor there, recently reopened the case in 2018, reopened the case to see what, if anything, could be done to fully reconstruct what had happened and to begin naming the names, naming the names of those who were involved in the death of this early day voting rights activists. And finally, let me share the case. Next slide. Let me share the case. This is my last slide, folks, of Edwin Williams, a case that comes to us from Algiers, Louisiana. Edwin Williams is photographed on not in this photograph, but he was with his wife, who was photographed on the left-hand side, with her 4 boys. Edwin Williams in 1943 was with his wife, Lillian, on their way to church. That very church you see in the photograph on the right-hand side. It's called the Beautiful Zion Baptist Church, and it's in Algiers. It's Wednesday night. They were going to Bible study, no doubt. And on their way, 3 white soldiers threw beer on Mrs. Williams and the baby that she was carrying in arms. Her husband protested, and the men came down from the viaduct where they were standing, and they stabbed Mr. Williams to death in front of his wife and his 2 children. The gentleman on the right-hand side in the gray suit at the very end on the left-hand side is the man who was in her, who was a baby. I'm sorry, the gentleman one of these gentlemen, let me just leave it at that. One of these gentlemen was the baby in her arms. It's the second person from where I'm standing. This photograph records an event that took place on June 19th, Juneteenth of this past year, 2022, in the church where Edwin Williams was a member. And these are her sons and his sons. And we brought this story back to this family and to the generations beneath them. And they commemorated the life and sacrifice of their father at this event in June. So with that, I think I've given you a sense of the book, a sense of our work, and I'll leave this last slide here to say that here, this is again a plea for revisit, reconstruction, and reparation. This slide really just tells the story of an event which occurred in Arkansas of 1919. But I include it because I want to call your attention. This is a message from the sheriff after essentially what was a massacre in Phillips County in 1919. I include it to call your attention to the bottom lines. Stop, and this is addressed to the Negroes of the county. Stop talking, stay at home, go to work, don't worry, from the sheriff. And so I include it just to make the point that that state of mind, do not talk about this. Do not talk among yourselves about it. Do not organize to protect yourselves and your community. That was the aftermath of each and every one of the killings that I describe in this book. And that's why so many of them got buried and became invisible. And it's for us, while memories are still alive, to recover them, to restore them to the families. And again, as I say, to include them in what we teach each other, and what we teach in our American history classes. Thank you so much. I'm delighted now to talk to you and to talk to Lamerchi Frazier.
Thank you, Professor Burnham. This has been a moment of real, almost inexplicable injury to us that you have brought to us through your database, your archive, and the thousands of stories, and many, many more. So we thank you and are excited about your work and the decision that you and Professor Nobles have made to dedicate the kind of time that you have done to create this archive for us to have to understand more and be more human and better. So I'd just like to say that it is a privilege to sit with your genius as we honor you as a scholar, a human, first of all, a professor, a judge, a lawyer who has sat and listened to these stories, even in a real courtroom, as I remember that you are the defender of Angela Davis in your youth as a friend, but more importantly, as a known activist, and that you sat on the Truth and Reconciliations Committee for that which was examining apartheid in South Africa. And I wanted to know, this is my own personal question, and one of the audience members also asked this, what connections this had to the work that you're doing, and how did it influence you to open these cold cases? That experience must have had some really inspiring and purposeful effect on you as a lawyer, professor, judge, and all the things that you have done in your life. Could you explain some of that to us?
Thank you so much for that question, Lamerchi, and it's one that I get quite a bit. So I hope I can offer a cogent and concise answer. I have in mind our time. You mentioned my work in South Africa with a precursor to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and my ability to see and participate in what they did there, and also my long connection with civil rights issues, both as a scholar and as an activist and as a participant in civil rights issues here, all led me to this work, naturally led me to this work. And I also was deeply engaged when I met with family members, because when they told me that no one had ever called them before, they'd never really gotten any interest in these stories. That was striking to me. And that's why I put our students to work to see if we could fix that. Okay. Thanks so much for that question.
Well, it is one that has been really plaguing me in terms of how you have the fortitude and the strength to broach these questions that their families must have, and how our audience must be thinking about some of what the work is and what it entails in terms of your own empathy and your own legal mind as you apply what you know to these cases. One of our audience members has asked, will the death certificates of these cases state homicide? Or did the officials use other terms to gloss over the crimes that you found?
Thank you. So the book is titled By Hands Now Known. And that is a play on a term used by coroners and officials in examining these cases, lynching and other cases like them, where crowds would gather. And everyone in town knew who committed the murder, and yet the death certificate oftentimes read by hands now known. These deaths were sometimes recorded as accidents, sometimes recorded as homicides, but rarely recorded as murders, because obviously if there was some indication, or rarely recorded in a way that would, let me put it this way, rarely recorded in a way that would lead to prosecution. So that we have collected all the death certificates, and in some cases where the death was recorded as an accident and we knew that wasn't true, we have tried to amend it and successfully amended those death certificates even 50, 60 years after the event. But all the death certificates are available for all the cases that are in the archive. As a matter of fact, we didn't include cases where we could not find some evidence, some official evidence of death.
Okay. If you had to talk back to this text that you've written, what are the things that you want to make accessible to us in our thinking? And what would be your most ardent desire of who is reading this text? And then what are you least concerned about with this book?
I hope that the book will get as wide a readership as possible. And I also hope that it will be shared in college classrooms across the country. And I've had some sense that that is happening, that college students and students in law are reading the material. I wrote this in a way that would render it accessible to as wide an audience as possible. And I try to situate the cases in the geography of these places, so as to give a broader sense of where we were and how we got there. But I also hope that the book will give folks a sense of what it was like to live at that time. So obviously the book clearly speaks to this time, but I wanted to speak to that time for us. I wanted to put us in that situation. We're not in that situation currently. But I want people to understand what it was like to live in Jim Crow, that it was more than Rosa Parks on the bus, although it's critically important as that well-known story is. It was more than Emmett Till, that this was the air people breathed and the roads they walked. And they had to accommodate themselves. They had to make choices. They had to decide whether they were going to fight or run, and decide whether they were going to put these histories behind them or live with them. And so I think it's so important, having listened to these family members, fully to appreciate what it is they lived through.
Okay. But as you negotiated these different geographies in your introduction, you talk about the stories of the victims of Jim Crow and the communities that came to their aid, and anchor this account of racial violence and the legal system that fostered it. Important not only for what they teach us about Jim Crow, these stories point to an ideological debate about the American future that transcends the criminal legal system. Can you talk about that just a little bit as we are now in our American future, as we go every day, what that means in terms of transcending?
Here I'm speaking to the need fully to take this history on board, to do more work in this field, to reach out to more families and tell their stories, and to make this part of the curriculum that we use when we tell the story of our country's history, to honor every stripe in that flag, whether it's a beautiful stripe or maybe one we regret, and so that and I say, obviously we need to do that for its own sake, but as well, we need to do that in order fully to understand how we got to where we are today, how we got to the point where we some of the fundamental issues of the 20th century are still being debated today. Some of the fundamental victories of the civil rights movement are still being put to the test today. I tell this story in part to describe the ways in which the federal government failed us, and failed adequately to respond to this crisis, and why. I tell the story to make it clear that it was not until 1939 that we had a unit within the Justice Department that would address itself to these events. And even then, the laws were inadequate. I tell the story to relate the consequences of failing to adopt a lynching legislation, or failing to include protection against racist violence in the civil rights legislation that was adopted in the mid-1960s. So just fully understanding the nature of the federal role, the nature of resistance in African American and allied communities, and the nature of the violence.
So I think that you wanted to read something to us, but we really appreciate what you've shared with us. And I just want to tell everybody to absolutely get this book. It is thrilling in terms of what we can learn about going into our future. But I'd like to thank you, Professor Burnham,
thank you so much.
Your work and your sacrifice, and your grooming the students of the future to recognizing and acknowledge this important history.
Thank you so much. And I'd be delighted to read just a few paragraphs. This chapter is titled "A Fight with Some Sailors," and it tells the story that I related at the end of the book, the death of Edwin Williams by 3 sailors in Algiers. When she was not working as a nurse's aide or cleaning other women's homes, Lillian Williams sold snowballs to her neighbors in New Orleans. In 2012, at 99 years of age, she passed away. At the beautiful Zion Baptist Church in Algiers, a long line gathered in front of the pulpit to extol her virtues and accomplishments, among them providing for her sons, whose well-being depended in some measure on the accumulation of small coins from snowballs. At her funeral, her son James eulogized Lillian Williams, for he was the pastor at Beautiful Zion Baptist, the church where Lillian and her husband, Edwin Williams, had worshiped, and where in 1943, Edwin's funeral was held. At Edwin's funeral as well, 69 years before Lillian's, mourners filled the pews and spilled over into the aisles. They praised the deceased and then walked quietly to the front pew to comfort the young widow and her fatherless sons, of whom at the time there were 4. Maybe Edwin Williams' brothers, 2 tenors, sang the group New Orleans Gibbs Quartet most well-known song, "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah." A local newspaper reported that ministers from churches across the city were in attendance, as were the deceased friends, white and colored. Somewhere within her body, Lillian Williams buried for those 69 years and took to her grave the calamity of Edwin's murder. Only rarely did she talk to her sons about it, and she never shared it with her congregation, although some of the older parishioners would have remembered the event. What lay behind the years of silence she placed in divine hands, and there perhaps she thought it should remain unresolved, unexplored, and unexplained. A personal burden. She did not register her story in the archive of African American sorrow, nor did she pass it down to her sons and their children as a cautionary tale about the perils of whiteness, nor offer it up as an inscription on the Williams totem pole. All of that Lillian Williams left for others to do, while on her mantelpiece she placed a photograph of Edwin and moved on with her life. With a life that was at once pious and plenteous. She sang in the church choir, as her husband had done for 10 years, and she served as senior deaconess at Beautiful Zion Baptist. She stayed put in the home where she and Edwin had begun their family, only a short walk from the church and from the place where he was slain. She was grateful for the support of her family, especially her brothers-in-law, who took a keen interest in their nephews, tutoring them in the gospel music that had nourished the Williams clan and knit it together from one generation to the next. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burnham. We are very, very grateful for the honor of these families and their ancestors.
And thank you. And thank you, Lamerchi. Thank you, Professor Burnham, for filling out our picture, both of you, of this awful time of really bringing a family framework to our understanding of this era, which is so helpful to us and pointing really a way forward for all of us through this legal framework. It's really helpful. We got some really good legal questions, which I'll share with you, Professor Burnham, in the Q&A, and we all do need a way forward out of this. So thank you both for your work. And back to tonight, truly winding down to our presenters and partners. Thank you so much for this wonderful program, Professor Burnham, Lamerchi Frazier, and my partners in presenting here. We also, all of us, thank the GBH Forum Network for all they do behind the scenes to support these really impactful and thoughtful events. And to the audience out there in Zoom land, there were more than 400 of you. We really thank you. We are grateful to you for tuning in, for your questions, for your interest in this really important topic. We wish you a very thoughtful and a very good night. Have a good one.